Disclaimer: the following story is a work of fiction. It contains themes of conflict and redemption intended for mature audiences. All characters and events are entirely fictional. Viewer discretion is advised. They said Terran 5 was a graveyard for the forgotten, a place where secrets go to die. But beneath its emerald forests and jagged peaks, something was stirring. A spark, a reckoning, and it began, not with a battle, but with the clang of a hammer. The distant planet of Terran 5 hung like a jewel in the vast expanse of space, its surface a tapestry of emerald forests and jagged mountain ranges. This world, on the fringes of the known galaxy, had become a haven for those seeking to escape their past or forge a new future away from the prying eyes of galactic powers. Among its inhabitants was Helmur, a man whose hands once crafted the very weapons that ignited a war, now seeking solace in the simple act of mending tools and occasionally forging blades for the few who sought his services. Kael's forge stood at the foot of a looming mountain, its stone walls weathered by time and the harsh elements of Terran 5. The constant rhythmic clanging of hammer on anvil had become a meditation for him, a way to drown out the memories of destruction his creations had brought. As he worked, Kael's mind drifted back to a time before his self-imposed exile. He saw again the gleaming laboratories of the Terran Confederation's weapons division, heard the excited chatter of scientists as they unveiled their latest creations. He had been young then, brilliant and naive, believing that his work would bring peace through superior firepower. The memory shifted, and he was standing in a field of rubble that had once been a thriving city. The air was thick with smoke, and the sounds of despair. A child's doll, scorched and broken, lay at his feet, a stark reminder of the true cost of his innovations. Kael shook his head, banishing the ghosts of his past. He focused on the present, on the simple blade taking shape beneath his hammer. This, at least, was honest work. A tool, not a weapon. A chance, however small, at redemption. But on this day, as rain lashed against the worn shutters of his workshop, a different sound caught his attention. The creak of the old wooden door opening. Through the veil of steam and smoke that perpetually filled the forge, Kael saw a figure emerge, tall and lithe, with skin an otherworldly shade of blue. The stranger's body was a canvas of scars and burn marks, each one a story of battles fought and survived. But it was the weapon slung over her shoulder that truly caught Kael's eye. A sword, its blade dulled and pitted with rust, yet somehow radiating an aura of ancient power. The stranger's eyes, piercing and filled with an indescribable pain, locked onto Kael. Without a word, she strode forward, the hem of her tattered cloak inaudible, leaving wet trails on the earthen floor. With a deliberate motion, she unsheathed the sword and laid it upon Kael's workbench. The silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the persistent patter of rain on the roof and the occasional hiss of hot metal cooling in water. Finally, the stranger spoke, her voice a mixture of ice and barely contained anguish. "Are you a blacksmith?" she asked, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. Kael nodded, his eyes never leaving the rusted blade before him. "Yes," he replied, his voice rough from disuse. The stranger's fingers trailed along the edge of the sword, a gesture so gentle it seemed at odds with the hardness in her eyes. "Then do as I ask," she commanded, her tone brooking no argument. "Take this sword and fuse it with armor, the armor of those who have fallen by my hand." Kael's brow furrowed as he reached for the sword, The moment his fingers touched the hilt, he felt a resistance, as if the very metal itself was alive and unwilling to be moved. This was no ordinary weapon. It carried with it the weight of countless battles, of lives taken and forever changed. "This metal is unworkable," Kael said, shaking his head as he examined the blade more closely. "It's broken and useless." The stranger's gaze bore into him, her eyes flashing with a mixture of desperation and determination. "Not only steel has been broken," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I need this. I must do this." Kael felt a chill run down his spine, recognizing in her words the same haunted tone he often heard in his own thoughts. He looked at her again, really looked, and saw beyond the scars and the hardened exterior. Here was a warrior seeking not glory, but redemption. "Who are you?" he asked, unable to contain his curiosity. The stranger straightened, her posture a mixture of pride and shame. "I am Rivena," she said, "of the Kaelin race." Kael's eyes widened in recognition. The Kaelins were legendary throughout the galaxy, known for their unwavering sense of honor and their role as protectors of the weak. But the woman before him bore little resemblance to the noble warriors of legend. Her eyes held secrets, dark and terrible. "The Kaelins are heroes," Kael said cautiously. "Defenders of—" "I am no hero," Rivena cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. "I am a traitor to everything my people stand for." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. Kael remained silent, sensing that Rivena was on the verge of revealing more. "Years ago," she began, her eyes unfocusing as if looking into the past, "I served in the elite forces of my people. We were revered, respected, feared, but I sold my skills to the highest bidder. The Terran Confederation offered me wealth, power, purpose. They told me I would be bringing peace to troubled worlds." Kael felt his stomach twist. He knew of the Terran Confederation, an ever-expanding human empire with a reputation for ruthless efficiency in dealing with those who stood in their way. Rivena continued, her voice growing bitter. "I believed them. I led their forces against so-called rebels on dozens of worlds. I told myself we were restoring order, that the violence was necessary for the greater good." She laughed, a hollow sound devoid of mirth. "It was all a lie." She gripped the edge of the workbench, her knuckles turning a pale shade of blue. By the time I realized the truth, my blade was already drenched in the scars of conflict. We weren't suppressing rebellions. We were wiping out entire settlements. Men, women, children, elders. It didn't matter to the Confederation. They all fell before us. Kael felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had heard whispers of such atrocities, but to hear it confirmed, to see the toll it had taken on this warrior before him, made it all too real. Rivena's hand moved to the rusted sword, her touch almost reverent. "This sword is not a weapon," she said softly. "It is a memory. Every soul it has taken is now a part of me. I want to carry them with me, so that every blow I take is their vengeance, so that I will never forget again." Kael understood then the weight of her request. She wasn't seeking to create a new weapon, but a memorial, a penance. He nodded slowly, his mind already working through the complexities of the task. "I'll help you," he said, his voice firm. "But I warn you, it won't be easy. The metal resists infusing it with armor. It will be painful, both for the material and for you." Rivena's eyes met his, a flicker of gratitude breaking through her hardened exterior. "Pain is nothing new to me," she said, "and if it brings me closer to redemption, I welcome it." As Kyle began to gather his tools, a distant rumble caught his attention. At first, he thought it was thunder, but the sound was too regular, too mechanical. Ravenna tensed, her hand instinctively moving to the hilt of her sword. "They've found me," she whispered, a mixture of resignation and defiance in her voice. Kyle moved to the 0008. 000080519, speaker 2 Farages. Small window peering out into the rain-soaked landscape. 000805 D8. 004705 speaker 1. In the distance he could see pinpricks of light descending from the cloud-covered sky. Ships undoubtedly of Terran Confederation design. "Who?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "The Confederation," Ravenna replied, her voice hard. "They don't take kindly to deserters, especially ones who know as much as I do." Lethon felt a surge of panic. He had come to Terran 5 to escape war, to live out his days in peace. Now it seemed the conflict had found him once again. "You need to leave," he said urgently. "They'll tear this place apart looking for you." But Ravenna stood her ground, her posture shifting into a fighting stance. "I'm tired of running," she declared, her eyes flashing with a fierce determination. "If they come for me, I will face them here." Lethon opened his mouth to argue, but the look in Ravenna's eyes stopped him. He recognized the resolve of someone who had made their decision long ago. With a resigned sigh, he turned back to his workbench. "Then we better get to work," he said, picking up his hammer. "If you're going to face them, you'll need that armor." As Lethon began the arduous process of reshaping the rusted sword, incorporating it into a suit of armor that would bear the weight of Ravenna's past, the sounds of approaching ships grew louder. Time was not on their side, but in that moment, in the heart of the old forge, a spark of defiance was ignited, one that would soon burst into a flame of rebellion against the oppressive forces of the Terran Confederation. Miles above the surface of Terran 5, aboard the Terran Confederation's flagship, inaudible Captain Commander Voss stood before a holographic display of the planet's surface. His sharp features were illuminated by the blue glow of the map. Eyes narrowed as he studied the topography of the region where their target had last been detected. Voss was a man forged by ambition and honed by ruthless efficiency. His record in tracking down high-value targets for the Confederation was unmatched, earning him both respect and fear among his peers. But this mission was different, personal even. The fugitive they sought wasn't just another dissident or rebel leader. She was one of their own, a betrayer of the cause. As he studied the map, Voss's mind drifted back to his first encounter with Ravenna. It had been during the pacification of Nexus Prime, a resource-rich world that had dared to resist Confederation rule. Ravenna had led the assault on the planet's capital, her tactics brilliant and merciless. Voss had watched in awe as she systematically dismantled the planet's defenses, her blue skin stained darker with the blood of her enemies. After the battle, as they stood amidst the ruins of the once proud city, Voss had approached her. "Impressive work," he had said, genuine admiration in his voice. "The Confederation is lucky to have you on our side." Ravenna had turned to him then, and for a brief moment, Voss thought he saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. But it was gone, in an instant, replaced by the cold determination he had come to associate with her. "The Confederation's goals are my own," she had replied, Order must be maintained, no matter the cost. Now, years later, Voss clenched his fist at the memory. How could she have turned her back on everything they had fought for? The Confederation brought stability to a chaotic galaxy. Yes, there were sacrifices, but wasn't that always the price of progress? "Status report," Voss barked, his voice cutting through the low hum of the bridge's operations. A young lieutenant stepped forward, her uniform crisp and her posture rigid. "Sir, we've deployed reconnaissance drones to the sector. Initial scans show a concentration of heat signatures in this area." She gestured to a small cluster of buildings nestled at the base of a mountain range. Voss leaned in, his eyes focusing on the indicated location. "Magnify," he ordered. The hologram zoomed in, revealing a crude settlement, mostly abandoned structures, save for one that showed signs of recent activity. Smoke rose from what appeared to be a chimney, and the heat signature was consistent with an active forge. A thin smile crossed Voss's face. "Clever," he murmured, "hiding in plain sight among the outcasts and forgotten." He straightened, addressing his team. "Prepare a strike force. Full combat gear, stealth approach. I want her taken alive if possible, but do not hesitate to use lethal force if she resists." His eyes hardened. "Ravenna knows too much about our operations. She cannot be allowed to share that information with anyone." As his team scrambled to carry out his orders, Voss turned back to the hologram, his fingers tracing the outline of the forge. "Did you really think you could escape us, Ravenna?" he whispered to himself. "Your betrayal ends here." Back in the forge, oblivious to the approaching danger, Lethon worked feverishly on Ravenna's unique request. The process was unlike anything he had attempted before, not simply reshaping metal, but trying to imbue it with memory, with the weight of lives lost. Ravenna stood nearby, her eyes never leaving the glowing metal as Lethon worked. With each strike of his hammer, she seemed to flinch, as if feeling the impact in her very soul. "Tell me about them," Lethon said suddenly, breaking the tense silence that had fallen between them. Ravenna looked at him, confusion evident in her eyes. "About who?" Lethon paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow. "The people this sword has encountered, the ones you want to remember." And for a moment, Ravenna was silent, her face a mask of pain and regret. Then slowly, she began to speak. "There was a village on Zeros Prime," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They had refused to submit to Confederation rule. We were sent to make an example of them." She closed her eyes, lost in the memory. There was a young girl, no more than 12 years old. She stood in front of her family, a simple farming tool in her hands, ready to defend them against fully armed soldiers. Lethon listened, his hammer striking in rhythm with Ravenna's words, each blow seeming to draw out more of her painful history. "I hesitated," Ravenna continued, her voice cracking. "For just a moment, I saw the madness of what we were doing, but then..." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Lethon nodded grimly, understanding the unspoken horror. He reached for a piece of armor, a shoulder plate from a fallen Confederation soldier, and began to incorporate it into the growing patchwork of Ravenna's new armor. "And the others?" he prompted gently. Ravenna's words came easier now, as if a dam had broken. She spoke of miners on a desolate moon, of scholars who dared to question Confederation doctrine, of entire families wiped out for the crime of living on resource-rich worlds. With each story, Lethon added another piece to the armor, the metal seeming to absorb not just the physical blows of his hammer, but the weight of the memories themselves. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of purple and orange, the armor began to take shape. It was a patchwork of different metals, each piece bearing the scars of its own history. The rusted sword had been broken down and reforged, its essence now running through the entire, inaudible like veins of red-tinged steel. Ravenna stood before a cracked mirror, donning the armor piece by piece. It fit her perfectly, as if it had been molded to her very soul. The weight of it was tremendous, both physically and emotionally. But as she moved, testing its flexibility, she felt a sense of rightness, of penance begun. Lethon watched her, a mixture of pride in his craftsmanship and concern for what was to come evident on his face. "It's done," he said simply. Elea turned to him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Her words were cut off by a distant explosion that shook the very foundations of the forge. Both of them rushed to the window, peering out into the early morning light. On the horizon, they could see the sleek shapes of Confederation dropships descending, their weapons already firing at the outlying buildings of the settlement. Plumes of smoke rose from structures unlucky enough to be in their path. "They're here," Elea said, her voice hard. She turned to Kyle, her eyes blazing with a mixture of determination and regret. "You should go. This isn't your fight." Kyle looked at her, then back at the approaching ships. In that moment, he made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. "No," he said firmly. "I've spent too long hiding from the consequences of my actions. If they want a fight, they'll get one." He moved quickly to a hidden compartment beneath his workbench, pulling out a sleek rifle, one of his own design from what seemed like a lifetime ago. "I'm not much of a frontline fighter," he admitted, checking the weapon's charge. "But I can still hit a target at range." Elea nodded, a small smile of gratitude crossing her face. "Then let's give them a welcome they won't forget." As they prepared to face the oncoming assault, neither of them noticed the shadows moving in the nearby forest, other inhabitants of Terran Fav, drawn by the commotion, each with their own reasons for wanting to resist the Confederation's incursion. The once peaceful settlement at the foot of the mountains had become a battlefield. Confederation dropships hovered menacingly overhead, their engines drowning out the natural sounds of the forest. Smoke billowed from buildings hit in the initial barrage, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burning synthetics and wood. Elea and Kale had taken up defensive positions near the forge. Elea's new armor gleamed dully in the early morning light, each piece a testament to the lives lost by her hand. Kale crouched behind a partially collapsed wall, his rifle at the ready. As the first wave of Confederation troops began to emerge from their dropships, a voice called out from the nearby tree line. "Hey, over here!" Elea and Kyle turned to see a young woman with fierce eyes and a mane of unkempt hair waving at them frantically. Behind her, two men, one dressed in what looked like a modified Confederation uniform, the other in the practical attire of a spacer, peered out from behind the trees. "Who are you?" Kale called back, his voice tinged with suspicion. The young woman glanced nervously at the approaching troops before responding. "I'm Naira. That's Dax and Tovin," she said, gesturing to her companions. "We've been hiding out here trying to avoid the Confederation. Looks like that's not an option anymore." Elea's eyes narrowed as she studied the newcomers. "Why should we trust you?" Naira's face hardened. "Because we've all lost something to those bastards," she spat, her voice filled with venom. "And right now, we're all that stands between them and turning this place into another conquered world." Before Elea or Kyle could respond, the air was split by the sound of weapon fire. Confederation troops had spotted them and were advancing rapidly. "Fine," Elea shouted, raising her sword. "If you want to fight, now's your chance. But stay out of my way." As the battle erupted around them, each member of this makeshift group found themselves pushed to their limits. Elea moved like a force of nature, her new armor deflecting blaster fire as she cut through the Confederation ranks. With each strike, she felt the weight of her past, the soul bound to her armor crying out for justice. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. Kael provided cover fire from his position, his expert marksmanship taking down soldiers before they could get too close. But with each shot, he felt a pang of regret. These were weapons of his design, turned against their makers. Naira proved to be a scrappy fighter, using her knowledge of the local terrain to outmaneuver the more heavily armed troops. Her face was a mask of rage as she fought. Each Confederation soldier, she took down a small vengeance for her lost family. Dax, the deserter, fought with the efficiency of a trained soldier, but his eyes were haunted. Every familiar uniform he faced was a reminder of his own past, of the atrocities he had been part of. Tovin, the pilot, was more reluctant, clearly uncomfortable with direct combat. But his quick thinking and knowledge of Confederation tactics proved invaluable, allowing the group to anticipate and counter enemy movements. As the battle raged on, Ranaktar watched from the command ship, his face a mask of cold fury. This was supposed to be a simple extraction, not a full-scale engagement. He kept his calm, barking orders to his troops. "Converge on the primary target," he commanded. "I want Elea taken down. Use of lethal force is authorized." On the ground, Elea heard the change in the enemy's tactics. They were focusing on her now, waves of soldiers pressing in from all sides. Despite her skill and the protection of her new armor, she found herself being slowly overwhelmed. A lucky shot from a Confederation heavy weapon struck her squarely in the chest, sending her stumbling backward. The armor held, but the impact reverberated through her entire body. In that moment, she felt the weight of every soul bound to the metal, their pain and anguish threatening to overwhelm her. Kael saw Elea falter and tried to provide covering fire, but his position was quickly becoming untenable. "We need to fall back," he shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. Nira and Dax were already retreating, supporting a wounded Tovin between them. But Elea stood her ground, her eyes blazing with a mixture of pain and determination. "No more running," she growled, raising her sword once more. As the Confederation forces closed in, the air suddenly filled with the roar of engines. From over the mountain ridge, a battered but still formidable ship appeared, its weapons blazing as it strafed the enemy positions. A gruff voice crackled over an open comm channel. "Looks like you could use a hand down there. Hope you don't mind if we crash the party." Tovin's eyes widened in recognition. "That's the Star Dancer," he exclaimed. "I thought that old rust bucket was long gone." The unexpected arrival of the Star Dancer turned the tide of the battle. Its powerful weapons scattered the Confederation forces, forcing them to retreat to more defensible positions. In the chaos, Elea and her unlikely allies managed to regroup. As they caught their breath, the Star Dancer landed nearby, its cargo bay doors opening to reveal a motley crew of smugglers, ex-soldiers, and refugees, all united in their opposition to the Confederation's tyranny. The ship's captain, a grizzled woman with cybernetic implants visible along her jawline, strode down the ramp. "Name's Captain Vera," she said, her voice rough but not unkind. "Heard there was some trouble brewing on Terran V. Thought we might lend a hand to fellow Confederation dissidents." Alea eyed the newcomers warily, her hand still gripping her sword. "Why help us?" Captain Vera's cybernetic eye whirred as it focused on Alea. "Because every world the Confederation takes is another nail in the coffin of freedom in this galaxy. And frankly, we're tired of running." Before anyone could respond, alarms blared from the Star Dancer's open bay. One of the crew members rushed out, his face pale. "Captain, long-range sensors are picking up a Confederation battle cruiser entering the system. We've got maybe an hour before they're in range." The gravity of the situation settled over the group. A battle cruiser would have enough firepower to obliterate not just their small resistance, but potentially the entire settlement. Kyle stepped forward, his mind racing. "We need to take the fight to them," he said, his voice filled with a determination that surprised even him. "If we can disable that cruiser before it gets into range, we might have a chance." Ravenna nodded, a grim smile on her face. "I know the layout of those ships. If we can get aboard, I can guide us to critical systems." Captain Vera considered for a moment, then nodded. "The Star Dancer's got a few tricks up her sleeve. We might be able to get you close enough for a boarding action." She turned to her crew. "Prep for immediate takeoff. We've got a cruiser to crash." As the group began to formulate their desperate plan, Rannick Voss received word of the incoming Confederation cruiser. A cold smile spread across his face. Soon this pitiful resistance would be crushed, and Ravenna would face justice for her betrayal. Little did he know that the true battle, one that would shake the very foundations of the Terran Confederation, was about to begin. The Star Dancer shuddered as it broke through Terran 5's atmosphere, its hull groaning under the stress of a trajectory it was never truly designed for. In the cramped cargo hold, now serving as an impromptu briefing room, Ravenna stood before a holographic display of the Confederation battle cruiser they were about to assault. "The implacable," she said, her voice tight with a mixture of determination and old pain. "I served aboard her sister ship. These cruisers are the backbone of the Confederation's fleet, heavily armed, well-shielded, and crawling with troops." Kyle studied the schematic, his engineer's mind already identifying potential weaknesses. "What's our primary target?" he asked. Ravenna's finger traced a path through the hologram, highlighting key systems. "The reactor core is too well protected for a direct assault. But if we can disable the main power distribution node here," she indicated a spot near the ship's center, "we can cripple their weapons and shields without risking a core breach." Naira, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "And how exactly are we supposed to get aboard this floating fortress?" Captain Vera, the Star Dancer's captain, grinned wickedly. "That's where things get interesting, kid. Ever hear of a Trojan horse?" As Captain Vera outlined her audacious plan, tensions within the group began to rise. Naira, in particular, found it difficult to reconcile working alongside Ravenna, the very person she saw as responsible for so much suffering. "How do we know this isn't some elaborate trap?" Nira hissed, her eyes never leaving Ravenna. "She was one of them. For all we know, she's leading us right into their hands." Ravenna met Naira's gaze, unflinchingly. "You have every right to hate me," she said, her voice low and filled with regret. "What I did, there's no forgiveness for it. But right now, I'm your best chance at stopping the Confederation from destroying everything and everyone you have left." Dax, the ex-Confederation soldier, stepped between them. "I've seen firsthand what the Confederation does to deserters," he said grimly. "Trust me, Ravenna has burned her bridges. None of us would be alive right now if she was still working for them. The tension in the room was palpable, but before it could escalate further, Kyle intervened. "We don't have time for this," he said firmly. "Like it or not, we're all in this together now. If we fail, it won't matter who trusted who. We'll all be equally dead." His words seemed to fought past the hostility, if only temporarily. Nira backed down, though her eyes still smoldered with barely contained anger. Captain Vera clapped her hands, drawing everyone's attention back to the matter at hand. "All right, people, we're on final approach. Get to your positions and pray to whatever gods you believe in that this crazy plan works." As the group dispersed to prepare for their daring assault, Ravenna found herself alone with Kyle for a moment. The weight of her armor, usually a constant reminder of her past sins, felt heavier than ever. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "You could have stayed out of it, lived your life in peace." Kyle's hands busied themselves checking his weapon, but his eyes met hers with a steely resolve. "Because sometimes peace is just another word for looking the other way," he said. "I've done enough of that in my life. It's time to make a stand." Ravenna nodded, a newfound respect for the former weaponsmith blooming in her chest. As they moved to join the others, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't experienced in years: hope.